Hello, bonjour. My name is Jacqueline Nyman, and as the University of Ottawa's Vice President of External Relations, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's Chancellor's Debate. I want to thank you each for joining us for what I'm certain will be an exceptionally interesting discussion between the Chancellor of the University of Ottawa, Calin Rovinescu, and our very welcome special guest, Dr. John Bell. Whenever we gather for an important event like this, it is our custom to offer an Indigenous affirmation in support of reconciliation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of the land where the University of Ottawa is located, and we acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. The University of Ottawa's Chancellor Debate brings together thought leaders, opinion makers, and exceptional individuals to explore and discuss important contemporary issues. Today's debate is titled Time for Canada to Win at Biotechnology, especially vaccines. 2 or 3 years ago, this might have felt like an esoteric topic to many, but today, however, its relevance hits home for each and every one of us. Fortunately, we could not have two better people with us to unpack this urgent topic than Mr. Rovinescu and Dr. Bell, whose discussion will be moderated by another highly respected expert in the field of biotech, Dane Bedward. During this COVID-19 pandemic, humanity is facing a profound health crisis that has already left well over 3 million people dead. That this tragic figure is not already higher, far higher, is due to science. It's biotechnology, medical science, and evidence-based public health policies that have come to our rescue, or to be more accurate, to the rescue of some. For as we shall surely hear, the benefits of science have not been shared equally among all. And at the University of Ottawa, our biomolecular scientists, our medical doctors, and our researchers have all made significant contributions to the ongoing effort to reduce the impact of COVID-19. We're not alone in our commitment to science at the University of Ottawa, yet I'm proud to say that we are increasingly being recognized as leaders. At the University of Ottawa, we are determined to maximize the impact of our research in the real world and to help solve real problems and save lives. And with that in mind, I am honored to introduce our moderator for today's event, Mr. Dane Bedward, who once upon a time received his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Ottawa and who has since gone on to an extremely successful career in biotechnology. Coming from a business-oriented immigrant family, he has played senior roles at multinationals Johnson & Johnson, Nordion Inc., Genzyme Corp., as well as advised and served on the boards of numerous biotech and medtech entrepreneur-driven companies. I'm happy to say that Dane Bedward is also serving on our board of directors. Please welcome Dane Bedward.
Thanks, Jacqueline. It's good to be here with all of you today as part of a discussion that is near and dear to my heart. Biotech and medtech have been my focus since I graduated from the University of Ottawa. I spent 4 years working in a genetics research lab at McMaster University. I loved it, things worked out well. But the mice who kept getting away from me and running around in the lab could sense that this was not my calling. Dr. Irene Uchida, who headed up the lab, often talked about the role of serendipity in scientific and personal discovery. Much to her dismay, I opted for a career built on commercializing products based on discoveries developed by brilliant researchers like our guest today, John Bell. I was fortunate to work in Canada and Europe for Johnson & Johnson. This good fortune continued when, in 1995, I was asked to start the Canadian subsidiary of a US biotech firm, Genzyme. I eventually moved to head office in Boston as a senior corporate vice president international. Our focus at Genzyme was on patients, providing them with the needed innovative and transformative enzyme replacement treatment. There were a lot of sick people who did not have the proper care because there were no treatments before the one that we were providing. It was a privilege to help them, and as a result of helping them, to be part of building a global biotech firm with $4.5 billion in revenue. Today, there is a tremendous economic potential in biotech for Canada. The market size and global health application segment of biotech is expected to reach $1.2 trillion by 2028. There are already 900 biotech companies of all types in Canada, the greater portion of which are medical products oriented. However, our healthcare system is not about the value of the market. It was built because of the values we hold as a nation. Patients are the reason I am so passionate about today's topic. Canada needs to win at biotech because it will help patients, our family members and friends desperate for hope in their battles against cancer and other terrible diseases. Our Genzyme CEO, Henry Tamir, reminded us that making the drug was not enough, and building a company was not enough. We in the industry bear the responsibility for bringing medical innovation forward to better meet the needs of medicine. But there's more to the story than that. Canada is a great country, and I'm convinced we must be self-sustaining when it comes to vaccines and medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Canada has a plan for healthcare, but no plan for healthcare infrastructure and sustainability. How do we get there? How do we make sure we are ready for the next pandemic? That's what today's conversation is all about. But before we get into the challenges of developing a biotech and vaccine industry from a Canadian perspective, I have a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom left of the page or the screen, you will see a button for questions. If you would like to submit a question for the speakers, please do not hesitate to submit a question at any time. We will try our best to get through as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. Si vous souhaitez écouter l'événement en français, vous trouverez en bas à droite de la page un bouton indiquant français. En cliquant sur ce bouton, une nouvelle page s'ouvrira et vous pourrez écouter l'événement en français. Okay, now let's get started. Kaylin, we know you as Chancellor and as one of Canada's top business leaders. However, people associate you more with airplanes than biotech. Can you tell us why you are so passionate about this topic?
Thank you very much, Dane, and it's fantastic to have you participate in this Chancellor's debate today. It's wonderful to have both you and John be as committed and as passionate to this as you are. Before answering your question and kicking this off, I just want to sort of mention for those that are perhaps listening to one of these Chancellor's debates for the first time as to what I've been seeking to do with them. We've since I was appointed Chancellor several years ago, we've had interesting topics on everything from the future of work to the evolution of a technology ecosystem to social entrepreneurship, to lots of interesting topics that I, in consultation with our team at the University of Ottawa, consider to be topical and that could have some bearing on making for a better environment. And we typically invite students, faculty, members of the broader community, academics. We've held an event at Shopify. So this is what we seek to achieve. And so for this topic, as Jacqueline mentioned in the introduction, probably would have been seen as esoteric a couple of years ago. But of course, it takes a totally different bearing right now in 2021. And we've labeled it, we put the words vaccines in there because we knew that would get folks' attention. And that was sort of our mini marketing pitch here to ensure that we had good attendance. But really, my intention with today's topic is to be quite a bit broader than just vaccines. What does it take for Canada to win at bio-innovation, bio-manufacturing? My own background, I think as many know, before becoming CEO of Air Canada, I had a long career in the private sector as a corporate lawyer and worked with some of the most important Canadian companies. And one of them was in the biotechnology area, Biochem Pharma, which was an early adopter of this innovative biotechnology research and development and commercialization. And what I saw over that time frame is the strength of having that overlap of university environment, research, but entrepreneurship driving it to the next level. And as exciting as that was in the 80s, my sense is that Canada has taken a step back. We need to actually give it a shot in the arm. And I thought that this was a great way to spend some time and understand what it takes for Canada to get back on track. Those days, when we talked about Biochem, it was a company that did well in diagnostics, did well in vaccines, did well, of course, in therapeutics with their key AIDS drug. And then they were bought by GlaxoSmithKline Beecham, which is a normal evolution for evolving innovative companies. And that, I think, is a really good segue to introduce John. John Bell, who is one of the great sources of pride of the University of Ottawa. And John, I'm not going to do justice to introducing you, because I think I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit as to why I consider you to be at the perfect intersection of research, academia, entrepreneurship, taking ideas out of the lab and into the real world. So just maybe before we get started here, tell us a word or two as to your own career and background as both a researcher and now entrepreneur.
Sure, thanks, Kellen. Yeah, my career started in Hamilton, actually. I grew up in Hamilton and got my PhD at McMaster. I don't remember seeing Dane there, but he was probably wandering around campus as well. But I went from McMaster to University of Ottawa for a brief time, and then to the UK to get further training after my PhD. And ultimately, I started my research career at McGill University, which is a great university, and I was in a great department there. But an opportunity came up to move to Ottawa, join the University of Ottawa and the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. And the attraction for me was, I'd been working for many years at that point and was doing, I think, good work curing mice, but, I was tired of curing mice. I wanted to do something for people. And here in Ottawa, the opportunity was provided to really take our work from the bench and translate it into the clinic where it could be tested in people and hopes, to get cures for people. It was the dream, still is the dream, of course. And so my wife and I moved our family here to Ottawa about 30 years ago. And it's been an awesome place to live. As all of you, I'm sure, who are listening know how good a great city Ottawa was. And it's been a great institute to work at. I've had some tremendous trainees here. And it was a really good time, but at the same time, I still felt I needed to get things out of the lab and into the clinic faster. And the way to do that was to find other sources of money and to recognize that commercialization is critical. You cannot do this on grants alone. It's just too expensive a venture. And I was very fortunate to have a number of people from Ottawa who supported this activity. We formed a company called Generex, and really bright people joined in and invested in that company. And it was ultimately acquired by another company in Korea. But then we formed a second company recently called Turnstone Biologics, where again, we're commercializing some of the things we've discovered in the lab. So some of the great discoveries made by students at the University of Ottawa who worked in my lab are actually now being translated into products that are being tested in people. One recently, a PhD student of mine from the University of Ottawa, his thesis led to a virus product, which has now been acquired by Takeda and is being tested in the clinic. So it's really been an opportunity to learn about business, to learn about how to take things from the lab and into the clinic. And I think that's one thing that we really need to do a lot more of here in Canada, because we have a very rich, group of scientists making great discoveries. But it's we're going to talk about, Callan, it's really that next step that has been really holding a lot of us back.
Thank you, John. And so I'm going to start in introducing the three themes. But before doing so, and I know that there are many, several hundred people listening in on this call. Amongst them, we have Mona Nemer, who's the Chief Science Advisor of Canada, and and of course a former Vice Rector at the University of Ottawa, and really one of the great scientific minds in our country. I'm grateful to Mona for joining us, and we also have Monique Leroux, who is the former retired chairman or retired CEO of Groupe Desjardins and the chair of the Industry Strategy Council that was appointed by the government to help in the post-COVID environment. Thank you both, Mona and Monique, for joining us today. It's we're grateful for that. So, here are the three topics we're going to try to unpack today. And given that it's meant to be a debate, that the debate is the quote unquote hook, we're going to actually occasionally introduce topics through a controversial introduction, just to make it more fun and more interesting. But the themes are going to be what went wrong with the COVID vaccines. And when we talk about what went wrong, we're not talking about the procurement discussions. Obviously, that's been broadly covered in the media. You know, whether and how we could have procured better, we're going to leave that discussion for another day. But what went wrong? Why is it that Canada does not have a vaccine industry at this moment in time? Secondly, how does Canada rate not only on COVID vaccines, but also on bringing new therapies to the market, and why? And what will it take for Canada to lead in this area? These are sort of three things that we're going to try to unpack. And if we can answer those three questions in 45 minutes, I think both John, you and I will get the Nobel Prize for Innovation ourselves here. So let's go back to the early days of the pandemic, John. I think we believed that Canada, as a G7 country, or at least as a G20 country, that Canada would be able to take care of itself when it came time to vaccinating its citizens, providing therapeutic drugs to help its citizens. And we were, I think, somewhat surprised by the lack of an industry in this area. When we start looking as to why that is, how far back do we have to go? I think that one of the areas I want to touch a little bit upon is I would say the industry having evolved from one of innovation to one of generics as well, what bearing that has had, and how far back do we really need to go to understand why it was that Canada was not able to take care of itself in terms of vaccines and therapies in any kind of a timely fashion.
It's been a chronic problem for probably 60, 70 years in reality. I mean, we've made some brilliant discoveries in Canada, as you well know, Callan. The discovery of insulin, which has changed the lives of many people around the world, and it's never been manufactured here in Canada. We've sent that off somewhere else to be made. We haven't benefited from that perspective. But, I think if I just think about this current pandemic, it's caused by a virus which is called SARS-CoV-2. And the reason it's called CoV-2 is because it's the second SARS virus. In 2003, which is, almost 20 years ago, it's getting close to 20 years ago, we had the first SARS virus that came through here. We were woefully prepared for that. We didn't have a vaccine or a drug for it. And we got lucky that it was as contained as it was. And obviously, this is not what's happened now. And so really, we had a wake-up call in 2003 where we could have built the infrastructure to have a vaccine industry, to have our own, to take care of ourselves, as it were. And we didn't do that as a country. I'm not saying any particular government. I think it's been a chronic problem for many governments. It's just a matter of we're not putting the resources, and we rely too much on other people to take care of us. And I just think that's the wrong approach. We need to take care of ourselves, and we need to build the kind of infrastructure that's required to allow us to develop our own discoveries. Many of our discoveries go south of the border, as you well know, Callan. And so why is that? We need to really start to, I think now, more than ever, think about this problem and have a strategy moving forward, and not just simply trying to subsidize and a few band-aids. We really need to actually start to really think in a fulsome way about how to solve this problem.
I'm going to put a statement out there as a start to this conversation to say that Canada benefited tremendously from the creation of a generic pharmaceutical industry. Is that a statement that you would agree with, John, or not?
Well, it depends what you mean by benefited, I guess. Some people probably did benefit. I think it's probably hurt us because we're not innovating. And I think that's the problem.
Okay, so let's understand that. Okay, exactly. No, I mean, that was a trick question, and you answered it correctly. The reality is that for sure, lower prices on some generic drugs are helpful to some in some quarters. But what does that mean? What is an innovative pharmaceutical industry? Let me ask you a second trick question here. Large pharma are the ones who develop innovative solutions. True or false?
Well, I think at one point there was a lot of innovation in pharma, but they recognized that it was very costly for them to do it. And in fact, innovation that comes from universities and from the research institutes, and pharma recognized that a long time ago, and they really scaled back their own discovery labs. If you look at the Pfizer vaccine is actually originally started in an academic research institute, an academic research lab, a gentleman, Ugur Sahan, who developed that. So really, these are the innovations that come from that are developed within the university academic environment, and appropriately, they eventually get taken on by pharma, who does all the heavy lifting in terms of product development. But the actual innovations are happening really across our country in the research institutes and the academic universities. That's just the way it has evolved, and pharma really has decided that what they're going to do is, and I think it's perfectly appropriate, to step back and look for the best innovations and then develop those.
No, and I think, and I say that in a sense, both of those themes, this is why I'm leading with this. Is one, I personally believe that the generic industry has destroyed or has largely destroyed the innovative pharmaceutical industry. Two, that innovation comes out of universities. Innovation comes out of people like yourself. Innovation comes out of we talked earlier about Biochem Pharma, which really that was the Institut Armand Frappier in Quebec that had the original compounds for the 3TC, which became the key compound in the AIDS cocktail drug. That came out of university, but they could not commercialize it. It took an entrepreneur to commercialize it, and then ultimately was bought out by big pharma. And that is the life cycle ecosystem of this process. And I think that the combination of what's gone on here for several decades in Canada has destroyed that industry to many degrees, and we really do need to start rebuilding it back. So that sort of sets a little bit of the base groundwork, and you're batting 100 so far, because even though we should be debating with each other, we're in full agreement. So let's we also talked about some of these companies that were able to do things and that subsequently left the country to go to the States or to go to Europe. But why don't we start now identifying? If we have to start putting together somewhat of a list. If we have a blank sheet of paper or a blank whiteboard, and we're starting to put issues on a table as to what does it take to build from scratch. Let's say we're going to be sitting here, you and I will be sitting here in 20 years' time, and we say Canada now has got a thriving, innovative pharma industry that can develop and manufacture vaccines, that can develop and manufacture therapeutic drugs. What is it that it takes? So let's start putting issues on a whiteboard. What's at the top of your list, John, as far as you're concerned?
Well, it's hard to have one thing at the top, because there's a lot of the real struggle here is that it's a continuum, right? You have to start from really fundamental research, people who are curiosity driven, trying to make discoveries, and then you have to have those people paired with others who like to take that sort of almost academic idea and convert that into something that has maybe more practical applications. And that still is all happening at the university level, at the research institute. But then once you make a discovery, we made some interesting discoveries about viruses many years ago, but we would have gone nowhere with them if we didn't have the opportunity to then manufacture those so they could be tested in people, because it's really in people where these medicines have to be tested. And so, we need then to have people who understand how to take something from the lab and convert it into something that can be manufactured. Then you need to have clinicians who are interested in these products and clinicians who want to understand them and test them in people and do clinical trials. And this, again, is something that's really not well supported in Canada, unfortunately. In these clinical trial areas where we actually see what products are not working or which ones can be improved. And often they require a little bit of an iterative process where you go back to the lab and so on. So you really need to have engaged clinicians. And this is all happening in one continuous stream. Ultimately, you want to get a venture capitalist, biotech, investors of all sorts to say, okay, you've got something that looks good. Let's take the risk on that. Let's try to see if we can make this become a real medicine and put money into that. And that requires a lot of investment from venture capitalists and other kinds of investors to take a chance on these technologies and build them up. But then again, we need more manufacturing capacity. We need to have people who understand this from the management perspective. It's a very complex ecosystem. And I think you can't just add money at one end or the other and hope that it's going to work. You have to fund this across the board. You have to build the infrastructure and the community to make this really happen. And ultimately, it will be taken up by a pharma company, undoubtedly, often will be. And these are certainly international companies that can then take that and really turn it into something that's can be marketed. But we could also potentially do that in Canada if we had enough know-how and interest in doing that.
Well, no, I mean, I think, you've said a lot of things there. And I think that, in terms of, for the folks who are listening in on this call, because many of them can influence outcomes, whether, they're coming at it from the scientific perspective or the private sector perspective in terms of funding. Let's start off by saying we need an innovation agenda and a strategy. And an innovation agenda and a strategy, as a country. And the good news is, at least in the most recent budget, there was really, for the first time in some time, the 2021 budget is a step in the right direction with but $2 billion allocated over 7 years to grow a domestic life sciences business and University of Ottawa. And I know that Sylvain Charbonneau is going to be commenting on this later about the Advanced Medical Research Center we're looking to participate in. We'll be a part of that. But it needs to be clear. It needs to have a strategy and a plan and achievable benchmarks and timelines for it, because otherwise we're not ever going to get out from under this. I would say this failure, if I could put it. We were musing in the pre-discussions to this chancellor's debate as to what we would rate the country's performance in terms of vaccines and biomanufacturing space. And frankly, I could not come up with a better grade than 4 on 10. And I think that as we look to say, what does it take to get better than 4 on 10? We need an innovation agenda. We need a strategy. We need to build a culture that is not as risk averse. And that means that some things are going to fail before they succeed. We need the region of Ottawa to speak with one voice, for example, where you've got so much attempt in Ottawa to achieve things. We need, as you say, clinical trials. And I think we need to spend a bit more time and talk about that. There is risk involved. There are human ethical issues involved with clinical trials. Why is it, and I want to come back to this in a minute, why is it that we have a culture that is somewhat averse to having expansive clinical trials for some of these vaccines and for some of these other therapeutics? Lack of venture capital. The United States and Europe have got a very healthy environment where venture capital is a key ingredient in the ecosystem. We've seen a few examples where venture capital has helped Canadian companies, and we've seen some big success stories recently, including AbCellera that came out of the University of British Columbia. But that is, they tend to be few and far between. And we need to have public support for investments in this space. We saw that when the government in the past few years was talking about innovation, it tended to be in so-called sexier areas, such as artificial intelligence or e-gaming, electronic games, and this sort of thing. Someone says we need to have the public moving in the direction of investing in biotechnology. Nobody cared about it until we had the pandemic in our face. So, if I was looking at a whiteboard, I'd be putting these items up on the board. And let's go back. Let's understand, John, a bit more clinical trials, and maybe you could unpack this a bit for us, both in terms of what you think objectively as to what does it take for a country to have a good clinical trial ecosystem, but maybe at the same time to share with us who you consider are the best university private sector partnerships that have existed out there. Are they in Europe or the US? And what impact has that had in terms of clinical trials in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, clinical trials are really not well understood. I would argue people don't really understand what they are, but they're a critical component of patient care because we don't have medicines to cure everybody for sure. That's really a tragic part of this. I mean, it's really not to get off your question too much, but we've been so reactive as a country, but not proactive. And 30,000 people tragically will die from the COVID pandemic this year, but every year 200,000 people could die from heart disease or cancer. So we're not putting that kind of money into those diseases, and they're going to happen again and again. And the only way we can get past this is to do innovative medicines. Biological therapies, I think, are a great way to move forward, that are being developed here in Canada. They then have to be tested in patients, and patients are anxious to have an opportunity for something else besides the standard of care, which often fails them, unfortunately, at least in the cancer space, where often people are told that there's really nothing else we can offer you. And that's where clinical trials come in. That's where we say, okay, let's test some new ideas we have, some new opportunities. And I've spoken to many patients who have been on some of the trials we've done, and they often say the same thing. They say, I don't know if this is going to help me or not, but I know that it'll help you discover better things that'll help someone else, maybe my son or my grandson. So I think there's a willingness amongst people to do this, but there's not support to do the clinical studies that we need. We have to sort of piecemeal money together from agencies like the Canadian Cancer Society or Terry Fox or something to try to support clinical studies. And we really need to have the money to allow clinicians who are scientists as well to test some of their ideas, scientists' ideas in the right setting.
But let me interrupt you there for a second, John, because I'd say, money is one thing, but is my sense, and, obviously I'm viewing this thing somewhat as an outsider. My sense is that even with all the money in the world, like let's say we had in Canada some capability to have developed vaccines, would Canada have been willing to put the vaccines into the arms of people as early as, say, the Oxford study was doing it in the UK? Would we have done that realistically? In your opinion, would we have done that? Would we have allowed Canadians to, even if they were ready, willing, and able, would we have, as a country, allowed them? And if not, what does it take to get the country there culturally?
I think we would have, Callan, to be honest. I think if there had been something that was far enough advanced at that time that there would have been, I've worked with Health Canada a lot, and I find them to be very easy to work with in a sense. They're willing to try new things, at least the people you work with there, as long as it's safe. And I think there would be an appetite to have clinical studies. We have a great clinical trials group for vaccines in Halifax, for instance, which is test the flu vaccine every year. So I think that would have been possible. I just feel the technology was just not there at that time. Or we had medicines that needed to be manufactured, and we didn't put the money behind getting them manufactured. And so the Pfizers of the world just leapt ahead. But I'm glad you brought up the Oxford. Oxford is a great example. This is another major vaccine which is helping to save the world from AstraZeneca, despite some of the unfortunate press, but it's actually really a very, very potent vaccine that my wife has received. I think it's a great vaccine. And it was developed in an academic institute, again, at Oxford. And then it was taken by a pharmaceutical industry, AstraZeneca, to rapidly get it up and running and become a vaccine that's really going to impact the world. So there are ways to do this. There are alliances that are built between great academic centers and industry where you can actually make these things happen. We need to cultivate more of that here in Canada and get some of our discoveries into the industrial setting.
What is, when, you mentioned that was a good model. Which would you say are amongst the best in the world? Oxford, clearly seems like it was one, but beside Oxford, where would they be in the world, and why do we think that they are, successful, or perhaps more successful than what we've been able to do on a large scale in Canada?
I think your other point about developing a culture that's not risk averse, and I think in the UK, they're not risk averse. They're willing to try new things. Oxford's fantastic, but so is Cambridge, is another spectacular spot where some great medicines in the form of biotherapeutics has been developed. There's an antibody which many people with arthritis get, and it's really changed their lives. That was developed in Cambridge. But of course, in Cambridge in the United States, in Boston area, there's a tremendous interaction between industry and academia. There's more money for cancer research in Boston than there is in all of Canada. So it really is just a magnitude change in how they do things there. And Stanford, all of California has some great industries and academic interactions, which have really led to some great discoveries and advancements. We're working hard not to make that happen here. We're doing things that discourage pharma from coming to this country in many ways. And it's really a tragedy. I think the government sort of has, I think back to your earlier point, we need a vision. We need a vision and a strategy, not reactivity, but proactivity. We need to actually say, this is what we're going to do. We have lots of good government agencies, but they seem to be working at cross purposes sometimes. And I think we need to let's move forward. If we want to have this biotech industry, let's do the things that make that happen, that make pharma want to invest here and make clinical trials happen here, which is good for our patients.
And maybe, in terms of, I'm going to turn over to questions to Dane and questions in a minute, but the regulatory dynamic, again, when we're looking at best in class, best in the world, what is involved in having, it's one thing to say we need to have a strategy, we need to have a plan, we need to have clarity, we need to have funds, we need to have a venture capital group, we need to have a less risk-averse culture. But then now, as a regulator, you're dealing with regulators, and we say Health Canada has been reasonably good, et cetera, et cetera. What does it take in terms of overlapping regulatory environment, and what kind of collaboration can there be? I think a lot of folks who are on the outside say, well, gee, if the FDA has approved this, why is it that we need to now have to agonize, have our own standards here? And then why do we have to have, another agonizing conversation in Europe? And then, is there not a capability for intergovernmental sharing of information, some kind of, especially coming out of this COVID environment? As you say, we should have learned from SARS. We didn't. Coming out of this COVID environment, is there not an opportunity to have a less of a complicated regulatory process that can streamline approvals and can streamline them both inside Canada domestically as well as internationally from other countries that have already taken steps?
Yeah, no, there's no question. I as I said, I've had great experiences with Health Canada, but it does boggle the mind that a vaccine that's been approved in Europe and in the United States has to then go through another layer of regulation. It doesn't seem to make sense where we try to harmonize our regulations as we do. All the things that we manufacture here in Ottawa can be used anywhere in the world. So we've obviously harmonized our regulatory compliance issues. So it doesn't make sense that would take very long to do. I actually don't know how long it did take, but the fact that it was not 24 hours is a bit mind-boggling to me, because surely the data was there and we could all see it as time went on. But, I think there's a lot of things about regulatory issues that we have, and it's not even just Health Canada. Between our research institutes, we have research ethics boards, which rather than just have one research ethics board for all of Canada, we have to have one at each institute, which takes time and slows everything down and makes industry not want to work with each institute. There's things like that we could easily harmonize because the issues are the same everywhere we look. But there's other things. We're now facing this problem of skyrocketing prices in new drugs and new therapies, and our response has been to create this patented medicine prices review board, which I understand the concept behind it. It's to try to control pricing, but it's working at odds with our innovation ministry. So, one's discouraging pharma investment, one's encouraging it. We need to find a way to harmonize these things and work together with one clear objective, which is to make this a great place to do clinical studies, to make it a great place to employ people who are bright and motivated and part of this knowledge-based economy. And the way to do that is to create a place where you want to come and work because it's going to be economically good for you. Regulatory agencies are going to be very compliant to do things safely, but have some risk involved. I just think that's what we need to create.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that. So I think what I'll do here, and again, I think part of this is to benefit from this the tragedy of COVID to be able to accelerate some of the things that we've been as a country talking about for some time. So with that, thanks, John. So with that, Dane, turn over to you, and John and I will both continue to be actively involved in this discussion. But Dane, I know you've got some interesting thoughts and topics to raise on this, and then perhaps some from the audience. Over to you, Dane.
Okay, Thank you very much. That was a terrific conversation. It provided a lot of insights and raised a lot of important questions. That last question about the harmonization of regulatory being in the industry, that's been a question that's been discussed for the past 20 years. And we're getting closer to that. And in my discussions with regulatory people, you know, the common documents that they are sharing are getting more complete right now and better understood. So there are efforts being made in the industry by governments on a global basis to have that happen, but it takes so long.
Right.
It's just unbelievable how long it takes. So I'd like to ask a question about one of the big gaps I've seen. Currently, for the foreseeable future, most intellectual property arises out of research done within our academic and research institutes. What type of training or support do you feel our universities and governments need to make available to researchers that would like to launch their own companies based on their own discoveries?
Okay, so I'm going to, sorry, Dane, I'm going to start off, then I'm going to invite John, because of course, John is exactly at that stage right now where he is building a company. But from my perspective, you know, when I go back and I look to what has gone on here back to 1968, when you saw the beginning of the decline of the innovative pharmaceutical industry as a result of and the growth of this generic industry that I was referring to earlier, as a result of a change in legislation and got rid of patent protection. But that was the beginning of the end. So one, we do need to have good and proper and strong patent protection where people are not punished for coming up with good ideas, right? You know, it cannot be this theory of no good deed goes unpunished. Well, you know, if you do a good deed, you should be rewarded for it. If you get your patent, you get the value that attaches to your patent. Someday somebody pays you a lot of money for the value of that patent, and then you go and develop it. So one, you need the proper patent protection, and we have to kind of put the genie back in the bottle. As helpful as some of this generic industry may otherwise have been, you know, you're now at the stage where you do need to protect good ideas. And secondly, we've said good ideas come from the university environment, and that should be continued, that should be promoted. And that means, you know, giving, you know, the technology and the laboratories and all of the equipment that needs to be there. Yes, that should be provided by the government, by the university, and helping people come up with great ideas, protecting the patent, and then afterwards leaving it to entrepreneurs, whether they come from the university environment or they, you know, as the example with the Biochem Pharma that I talked about earlier, or with John's case, someone coming in from the outside to commercialize an idea, and then, you know, and then this ultimate partnership with Big Pharma will take some time, and this is how, you know, that is the ecosystem, I think. But John, over to you, and maybe just describe how you're seeing your own experience in terms of building your own company coming out of a great research project.
Well, you know, it is a struggle because there just is not the money available to do the patenting that we need to do. That is the reality. It's expensive to do. And our research institute and our universities cannot dedicate enough money to it. And then we have, even between universities, you know, some have better technology transfer offices and others, but they put more money into it. It's really a real problem, I think, that we need to have support from the government to make available to researchers and in research institutes good people who can actually work and help you make a decision. Because not every idea should be patented. I mean, it's clear that some things just shouldn't be patented. But you know, it's hard to predict that at the front, and you sometimes need to file something, and you really need to have people who are willing to put in the money to make that happen. We have good people here where I work, but they're really overworked. They're just too much for them to do, and we just don't have the resources to make it happen. But it's critical to as you say, Callan, if you don't protect it, it's just going to disappear. It's never going to be developed. It's going to be lost into the vapors.
But do you feel that researchers actually want to get into that commercial side at one point, or do they always want to transfer that out to Big Pharma?
It's like everything else. We're all different kinds of people. I happen to love doing this, but some of my colleagues, you know, they don't really want to do it. It's not something that interests them. So I think you need to have the opportunity and create a space where people who want to do it could potentially go out and do it. It's a lot.
My experience with the industries, with the biotech companies that I've worked with many years ago, is that there would always be a couple of scientists who really were not interested in the entrepreneurial side of it, really disliked it. And they would stay on in the company as it was being commercialized afterwards, but it was clear that that was not for them. They hopefully benefited financially because they contributed to the idea, but it took somebody else to bring it to the next level. And I think that is a healthy model. It's almost like a tripartite thing. You know, somebody does the research, participates in the development and the commercialization, and then ultimately, different folks take it to the next 2 or 3 levels.
Yeah, that's true. It takes different generations of leaders to get it to the final product, to the market, and commercialize on a global basis.
Yeah.
My second question before we go to the audience is as follows. Pandemics occur infrequently, thank goodness, but we need to learn from our mistakes and mobilize more quickly next time. John and Kalin, do you have any thoughts on how existing biotech companies can be integrated into a proactive crisis management plan next time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great idea, and that's being done in other places in the world for sure. Where, one example is in the United States, which has a tremendous infrastructure for biomanufacturing. For instance, they have over 1,800 GMP facilities. We have less than a handful. And it's because the government said to companies, we will build you your facility, you use it, but when we need it, you have to turn it over to us for the time, for exactly as you suggested, Dane, the pandemic situations. There are models like that. There's a model in Australia where we're doing something very similar. So there's ways to build that infrastructure, which is costly at the upfront, then get companies to use that infrastructure, develop the culture within the country for manufacturing of all kinds of products. But when you need it, you have an agreement that we're going to turn this over to you for the 3 or 4 months it's going to take to generate the vaccines that are required. I think it's a great model that has worked very well in many places in the world.
Yeah, and I would add to that. Look, I think that we know, and it's been highly immediate from media perspective. It's been discussed frequently as to the early warning system that Canada had for pandemics that failed because basically. Nobody thought that a pandemic was coming, and therefore, that organization didn't have the funds and so on. And PHAC itself was somewhat, sort of on the back burner after, despite the fact that it was only created after SARS. So I think that if I was to say my opinion on a secret sauce here, when you build an infrastructure like that, it has to have some, real day-to-day job when there's no pandemic around. And it could be a great partner in terms of research evolution, whether it's, an early warning system, people getting started early on vaccine preparation, but as part of a overall clinical trial. It should be part of, when we talked earlier about this, a vision and a strategy for the country, something like that should be a critical part of that, but it shouldn't only be sitting on the sidelines waiting for a pandemic to come. I mean, that's where, subsequent government after government will say, how much are we spending on this, sort of backstop, just in case it should happen. We're not going to spend, $100 million a year or $50 million a year just to have it just in case. So it has to have some other function and it has to be able to attract talent. Like, who would want to go and work for an organization that was just on the sidelines, waiting for a pandemic? So therefore, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure unless it is integrated wholly into a broader ecosystem of research, development, commercialization, and be seen as being an active participant in this biomanufacturing environment that we're seeking to develop.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this whole biotherapeutic sphere, these are similar products for different diseases. And so there's an ongoing need for this, aside from these vaccines that happen every 10, 15 years or something. And so it would be very easy to support those groups and have it there's a huge market. We should take a piece of that market and we should be using it ourselves to manufacture products that can be used for other diseases. And there's a lot of them. So, you're absolutely right, Kalin. It shouldn't be as dedicated to vaccines. That makes no sense. But dedicated to biologics, for which there are many, many that can serve as many diseases, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Right, and we also look at different manufacturing technologies. When we take Medicago, that has the ability to grow proteins in the leaves of tobacco.
Yeah.
And they can scale up quite rapidly, up and down. And maybe part of it is looking at different technologies, not looking at what exists today, but different technologies that could help us in our strategic direction and what we need as a small country wanting to have that type of protection.
Exactly.
So going now out to the audience, there's a question from Cathel. Really a question about what enabled COVID-19 vaccine to be released so fast, and can this cause health risks in the future for people who receive the vaccine?
It's a great question. I see that question circulating all the time. And I think we really need to address that. It was done quickly, but safely, because we had put resources behind it. The reason vaccines take a long time to develop normally is because we put no money behind them. The trials go slowly. The technology goes very, very slowly. Here we were in a global emergency. There was lots of resources put behind by Pfizer and other companies and AstraZeneca to rapidly get those out and test them right away. The technologies that we've got, these are not new technologies. People, you hear stories about, oh, these RNA vaccines are going to reprogram my DNA. This is just nonsense that has been perpetrated. I don't know by who, but these vaccines have been around for a long time, and they've been tested in many, many people before this pandemic. The specific sequence in them from the SARS virus, that is more recent. So we really understood how these vaccines would work, and we understood how to do the test quickly and in large numbers to get them out there. So I think it was a great example of how things can be done quickly if we're willing to put the resources behind it. And I don't think any of these vaccines are particularly dangerous in any way, shape, or form. The AstraZeneca one is interesting how we've seen these very rare events happening. But in the context of the global community, I think this would never have been seen anyhow if we didn't have a large number of people being vaccinated. So it's a really interesting question, but I'm very convinced all these vaccines are quite safe and have been tested adequately.
Yeah. I would agree with you. And also there are new technologies now that allow us to do this, to communicate rapidly, to get data crunched on a very rapid basis. So it's a different world that we're living in, and it'll probably be different after we get out of COVID.
Yeah.
So another question has come in from Anon. Both John and Kaylin have made the point that we need strategic and risk-tolerant investments in biomedical therapeutics. What about the idea of setting up a federal crown corporation to implement a national biotherapeutics manufacturing strategy?
Look, that's a really good question, and I think it actually will feed into some of the initiatives that are contemplated in terms of a centralized strategy. It can't really be just a crown corporation, in my opinion. It has to, by definition, involve the private sector and the university environment, the universities, plural, obviously not just University of Ottawa. But the kind of Ottawa Health Innovation Hub that we're discussing through the University of Ottawa is the type of thing that would meet, I think, that type of a question. And it for sure requires a big participation by government, whether it's through a crown corporation or through a department. If it's a crown corporation, it has to be an empowered crown corporation, because that's what we've often found, and we've seen it, unfortunately, with the infrastructure bank. A crown corporation is formed and then doesn't do anything. And I think that is, one of the risks of a crown corporation. I think if we're talking about an accelerated strategy, we've seen repeatedly that the private sector has to be a key participant in it. Cannot happen, in my view, without that. But John, over to you.
I'm not exactly sure how to construct it, but there's no question we need leadership from our country to say this is the direction we want to go in. We did have a nice program called Networks of Centers of Excellence, which was a great way to get discoveries across the country quickly, and we disbanded that, unfortunately. But something like that, and networks of research institutes working together, clinicians and scientists working together, it could be catalyzed by the government and led by the government, and would lead to spin-outs and industry throughout the country. And I think that's something we should look at very seriously.
Okay. Here's a question from Megan. What plans does Canada have, if any, to ensure the entire world is vaccinated especially poorer countries for whom the cost of COVID vaccine may be prohibitive?
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, it's a great question, and obviously complicated answers. I'll use my chancellor prerogative and punt the first part of that to John.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know, it is something that I know the people who I work with are very passionate about, and we think, you know, we talk about, you know, the concept of making biomanufacturing, as Callan mentioned. You know, you can't just let these manufacturing centers sit, you know, and with nothing to do. One way we could use an infrastructure that we invested in would be to make vaccines for countries that cannot support their own. And you need vaccines all the time. You don't just need them during a pandemic. You know, you need mumps, measles, rubella to go to all countries around the world, and other kinds of vaccines. So, you know, I could see where we made biomanufacturing industry, and part of its mandate is to help supply at cost new biotherapeutics for countries which can't afford them. As a Canadian, I'd be pretty proud of that.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think that's precisely the answer, is that, you know, in order to be able to, first of all, we should do that as a G7 country. I would say that it should be the responsibility of all of the G7 countries to contribute to something like that. And so the answer is yes, we should do it as a country once we're up and running, you know, having some capability. Two is it cannot only be COVID vaccines, because you can't build an infrastructure, or, you know, it has to be a quote unquote business, but you can't build a business on one vaccine. So it has to be something that is capable of doing other things besides that vaccine. Yes, I mean, I think that we know that until the world is adequately vaccinated, especially in you know, some of the countries that we know very well will never have their own vaccine capability, we should participate in that. And for the growth of that industry in Canada, it cannot only be to supply a small population country like Canada in any event. So it would be helpful that we had that international capability from inside Canada. So I would agree 100% that we should be doing that. It has to be done thoughtfully, but unfortunately, it's not going to be an overnight story without dealing with some of the fundamental structural things that we discussed at the beginning.
Okay. Now, an anonymous question. At one point, telcos in Canada were allowed to have monopolies in turn for a specific profit level and the requirement to conduct research and make the research available publicly, with all profit in excess of the allowed amount being put into either research or reduced rates for consumers. Would that be a better model for pharma in Canada, perhaps with research money being pushed to universities and national pharma companies, or into low-cost generics? The generics may not be an area that you want to go into.
No, it's a great, these are fantastic questions. And I love the fact that people are so thoughtful with these questions. That question could be the subject of a multi-hour discussion and debate, because it unpacks lots of things, including, you know, monopolies and so on and so forth. But you know, and unfortunately, I see it's 11:58. I know we have Sylvain Charbonneau who's on sort of standing by to join us in a minute. But I would give my 2-second answer to that, which does not do it justice, because it's a great question. I think experience globally has shown that in order to have a successful outcome, you have to have somewhat of a free market environment in terms of the evolution here. And you cannot have an environment where you have, regulated effectively. What we used to have in the telecom industry was regulated rates of return. You know, you'd have a regulated rate of return for a particular drug. So then the question is, well, would that pharma company be sufficiently incentivized to do what it needs to do for that if their profit is regulated? And if they have a better opportunity to invest elsewhere, they will. So I think that there has to be somewhat of a free market approach to growth here. And that's why this sort of, triumvirate of research being done in the universities, being then commercialized with the benefit of some entrepreneur, and then being, the participation of pharma has been somewhat of a proven healthy model. That's not to say that suggestion is a bad idea, because it could be a really good idea. But I think that, some countries need to have a cultural embracing of that, as opposed to kind of a cold shower one day, waking up and saying, we're now going to change all the fundamental drivers that have, been the foundations of the pharma industry. Maybe we'll pause there, Dane, because I
was just about to say, as you said, we have to wrap it up at this point. Thank you again, Chancellor Romanescu and Dr. Bell, for the insightful discussion. I would now like to turn the spotlight over to Sylvain Charbonneau, Vice President of Research at the University of Ottawa, to close the debate. Sylvain?
Thank you so much, Dane. Kaylin, John, thank you for this very interesting and provocative discussion. I also would like to thank everyone for joining us today, students, faculty, alumni, friends of U Ottawa, and a special shout out to colleagues from federal, provincial, and municipal governments. At the University of Ottawa, we are so lucky to be in the nation's capital, to the point of convergence for government, academia, health and medical science, and technology companies. We have great scientists like John. We have so much talent we can count on. We have Professor Marc-André Langlois, the leader of a new national network based right here at the University of Ottawa to respond to the threat of new COVID-19 variant. The network received $9 million just over a month ago from the federal government. Mes plus sincères félicitations à Marc-André et son équipe. Nous sommes fiers de faire notre part dans la lutte contre la COVID et d'aider le Canada à mieux se préparer à la prochaine pandémie. We have learned all a great deal and a lot of lessons over the last 14 months of this pandemic. For me, it has driven home the fact that the future of medicine will be shaped by scientists, clinicians, entrepreneurs, and government working collaboratively. That is why we are driving forward with an exciting new project, as was referred to by our Chancellor, the Advanced Medical Research Center, which will be built adjacent to our Roger Guédon building on the Alta Vista campus in proximity of the Ottawa Hospital and the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. It will have space for a very large number of researchers, including trainees, the next generations of scientists, and health tech professionals. We are going to provide the tools, resources, opportunities, and space for them to excel and lead. At the heart of this will be the Ottawa Health Innovation Hub, to connect discoveries with entrepreneurs and new companies with the business support of mentors, advisors, strategic partners, and venture capital firms. It will have dedicated incubation and accelerator space for fast-track research through discovery, innovation, commercialization, so new treatments and therapeutics reach market faster and impact patient care. It will encourage and foster collaborative research initiative with the private sector. And together with the Ottawa Hospital, U Ottawa is working to secure funding to support the expansion of biomanufacturing in Ottawa, which we heard from John is very badly needed. We heard a lot today about the many challenges Canada must overcome if we want to be a leader in biotechnology, especially vaccines. I'm confident we can do this. We have the brainpower, we have the momentum. As the recent federal budget showed, we have a government that is prepared to make critical investments. In fact, I look very much forward to welcoming you all to a follow-up event in 4 years from now. We will hold it in the atrium of this new Advanced Medical Research Center, and we will celebrate the progress we've made together in helping Canada win at biotech. Sur ce, je vous remercie encore une fois et j'espère que vous avez apprécié ce débat du chancelier. Je vous souhaite à tous une bonne fin de journée. Au revoir.